Shakespeare, The World as a Stage by Bill Bryson. Book review. So I came across this book because it was making the rounds in my office. Various people were reading it and then passing it on to each other, and it was just going around. And actually the coworker who passed it on to me said to me, "This is the best book I've read in a long time, possibly the best book I've ever read." Well, that is very high praise. I cannot go quite that far in my own recommendation. It was not the best book I've ever read. But it was an enjoyable little book. I completely enjoyed it. I'd recommend it. It's not the best book I've ever read. But I passed that along nonetheless because I thought maybe it was interesting to note that at least for some people, they considered this the best book they ever read. And not me, but some people. Actually, truth be told, I'd been meaning to get around to this book for a while. I've long been a fan of Bill Bryson, and in fact, I've read and reviewed positively on this YouTube channel many of his other books, The Mother Tongue, The Lost Continent, A Walk in the Woods, Down Under, and The Life and Times of Thunderbolt Kid. I've also been vaguely interested in Shakespeare. I was a literature minor in university. I took a couple different Shakespeare classes. I've not really been keeping up on my Shakespeare since then. I haven't been reading a ton of Shakespeare. Although I have reviewed a couple of Shakespeare books, Shakespeare plays on this channel. Henry IV Part 2, King Richard III, Midsummer Night's Dream, etc. But I didn't know anything, or hardly anything, about Shakespeare's biography before I read this book. So I was curious about it, and I was curious what a talented writer or an entertaining writer like Bill Bryson would make of Shakespeare's biography. Now, because I don't really know much about Shakespeare's life, I can't vouch for the accuracy of this book. Somebody else will have to take up the question of how accurate it is, or how up to date with the scholarship it is. All I can say is that it was fun to read. It's got the warm conversational tone you would expect from Bryson, plus the usual Bill Bryson humor. But it's also packed full of interesting little tidbits of information about Shakespeare and the times he lives in. He lived in. The central conceit, or joke, of the book is that we know so little of Shakespeare's life that it's almost impossible to make a book out of it. But let's try anyways. Bill Bryson lays out this conceit right in the first chapter. He says, quote, "To answer the obvious question, this book was written not so much because the world needs another book on Shakespeare as because this series does." So this is part of the HarperCollins series of biographies on eminent lives, and it sounds like Bill Bryson was drafted in there to write their book on Shakespeare. So they already had this series going, and they commissioned Bill Bryson to do the one on Shakespeare. To return to the quote, Bill Bryson says, "The idea is a simple one. To see how much of Shakespeare we can know, really know, from the record. Which is one reason, of course, it's so slender." You wouldn't think that this would make much of a premise for a book, but Bryson pulls it off. Bryson lays out the bare facts we know about Shakespeare, and then explains why we know what we know, and why it is that we don't know much else. In doing so, he frequently pokes fun of eccentric Shakespeare scholars, who have often spent years and gone to great lengths to search through thousands of 16th century documents just to establish the little that we do know about Shakespeare. On the other hand, Bryson also makes fun of other Shakespeare biographers who fill in the historical gaps by sometimes making wild inferences about Shakespeare's life based on questionable assumptions. And along the way, Bryson drops in the few little facts we do know about Shakespeare, and also talks a bit about the life and times Shakespeare lived in. In doing so, Bryson is easily able to stretch out the facts into a very readable 195 pages. What else is there really to say about this book? Well, I guess if I were pressed, I could come up with a few notes and quibbles. The section on Shakespeare's vocabulary and his contributions to the English language is essentially a repeat of information Bryson has already included in his previous work, The Mother Tongue. So if you've already read The Mother Tongue, it's slightly tiresome to have to read the same information twice. However, this makes up only a small section of the book. Only 6 pages, pages 108 to 114. So it's forgivable. Also, there are a few points in the book that left me mildly confused. And there are a few points I would have liked to learn more about. Maybe it's just me as a history buff, but I would have enjoyed more discussion about the politics and ideologies behind Shakespeare's history plays. This is something I've heard mentioned of in my school days. The fact that many of Shakespeare's plays were history plays were designed to reinforce the claims to the throne of Elizabeth I and James I, respectively. But I didn't know as much about this as I would have liked, and I would have enjoyed to hear more. Bryson mentions in passing that the Shakespeare play Macbeth makes reference to the gunpowder plot, but he doesn't actually give the actual line. I would have liked to read the actual line. Also, I would have liked some clearer idea of how much we know of Shakespeare's contemporaries. For example, on page 195, Bryson mentions in passing that Ben Jonson, one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, kept private notebooks. How much can we know about Ben Jonson's life through his private notebooks? How common a practice was this in the 17th century? And there are various other questions that are still lingering in my mind after reading this book. But on the whole, considering how easy this book is to read and how slender it is, you get a good education on Shakespeare for very little effort. You can't beat that.